what we'll do is the way things are going to be structured, you'll be able to complete workshops without a synchronous meeting. So for example, this first one, I asked folks to submit their draft paper. Hold on just one second. Here we go. So if you do that and you provide peer comments, right, because Canvas will automatically assign you peer comments here in a little bit, or excuse me, it'll assign you people to review. If you do those two things, you'll get credit for the workshop. So you don't have to be meeting synchronously in order to get credit for anything. I'll just adjust things such that the entire class can be handled asynchronously. So if you do have any problems, just let me know. Things are gonna crop up. I mean, I'm doing basically tech support for the College of Arts and Sciences, with a bunch of other people as well. And, you know, problems are just gonna pop up, but we'll fix them. You know, we won't get in a situation where it's, you know, it's like, well, I need to do this now, or I won't get credit or whatever. We'll just fix it as we go. So let me share my screen with you really quickly. Here we go. So briefly, I did want to point out here, this is on our resources page, which, you know, you can get to, it's just under modules and then resources. I just have this here because there are a couple of useful resources there. UNCW's Keep Learning page is there. That has a lot of sort of useful technical information about completing online courses, right? Preparing for online learning and getting access. Because, you know, just about everything's shut down. Libraries shut down. So, you know, how do you get access to materials and that kind of thing? The good news is there are services now put in place to do that. So that's there. Also, if you have spotty internet access, you can actually join these conversations just through phone. You obviously don't have video capability if you do that. But this provides a link. Basically, you just call a toll-free number. You just have to look it up here. And then it'll prompt you to put in a meeting ID. And this will be the same for the entire semester. And then you can just do it by phone as well. You show up here in the same place that the rest of us do. I think you don't have a video screen. So those are there. Oh yes, and the writing center is still functional. Obviously, they're not doing in-person meetings, but they still do online meetings. So be aware that the writing center is still a useful resource, particularly as we're wrapping up with our research paper and that kind of thing. And the writing center, you know, I haven't talked about it too much in class. Sometimes people see the writing center as a remedial resource, but it is not. I mean, it's there to provide feedback on work. The way we do peer feedback, I mean, that's very similar. And, you know, as someone who writes scholarly material, you do this sort of thing, both informally with colleagues, but then also formally. I mean, that's what, you know, that's partially what the peer review process is. So the writing center is a really useful tool. I encourage you to take advantage of it, really at any stage. Okay, so those are just some things I wanted to point out. Yeah. So as I mentioned, we should have our draft research papers in now. As I said, Canvas will automatically allocate each person to other people who turned in their drafts. Has anyone ever done peer comments through Canvas before? Seen a lot of heads shaking no. That's fine. Basically, it gives you this interface where it'll show you the person's paper. You'll probably be able to see it in the window, but if not, it'll give you the link to download it. And then it just has a blank on the right-hand side over here where you can comment. I can't show you right now because this is the test account. It just gives you the option to add a comment. And all I'm asking you to do is add a comment that answers these two questions. What do you believe is the draft's strongest aspect? If this were your draft, what is one way that you would consider revising it? So just sort of two general questions on your classmates' draft. It'll assign you two people. I'm going to check and make sure after this period ends, but it probably already is in place. And once you do those two, that's it. Those are due by the end of the day this Friday. We will actually have, for virtual class on Friday, just a brief, it won't be a full period, but we'll have sort of a brief look at doing those, making sure that everyone's able to access other people's work and that kind of thing. But if you do your peer comments, you submit your draft, that is the workshop, right? You don't have to meet synchronously. Just doing those things will get you credit. Are there any questions about that right now? Okay. As I said, we'll check back in specifically on Friday about this, and those are due by the end of the day on the 27th there. Let's see. Yeah, and then just a couple other things to point out. I'll be giving you audio feedback on your draft also. So you submitted those already. Between now and the rest of the week, I guess, I'm going to be giving you just audio comments. You'll get my feedback. You'll get peer feedback. One thing I noticed in going through the method designs, primarily, I mean, it popped up elsewhere, but people kind of figuring out what question am I answering, how am I answering that, right? Which is the method issue. And so the thing of it is, if your research question is already well answered by other existing work, you probably have to adjust your research question, right? Because when you're doing research, that's different than report. Report is presenting known information, as we've discussed, right? How does an internal combustion engine work? That's not really a research question at this point. It's a report issue, right? Here's how it works, because that's well established. So the issue is you want to think about, there's an existing body of scholarship on my topic. That's what the lit review helps us see. I have a research question that is part of this dialogue. What am I contributing to it? So it could be something like, well, this is the established knowledge in the field, but I'm going to apply it to a situation that hasn't had it applied to it before, right? One of the things we looked at is, like the local situation. So, this is something that's known generally. How does this manifest here, right? That's certainly something valid you can do. You can also do things like challenge existing work, right? I have another student who is pointing out that this is, from the lit review, this is sort of the main line that about what's going to happen to, I think it's marine animals as the pH in the oceans change due to carbon issues. But there are certain animals and certain classes of animal that may benefit, may thrive from this. So this is the existing understanding of what's going to happen, but there are counters to that, right? There are even ways to challenge it. This is what everyone says, and this is what everyone thinks about this topic. However, if we look at it in this other way, perhaps we see something else, right? So you can challenge the existing knowledge. You can also just straight up do replication studies. Have folks in here heard of the replication crisis? Does that come up in your other classes? Anyone? No? Okay. So right now, in sort of the sciences as a whole, definitely social sciences, even the natural sciences, it's less prevalent in the humanities because the way they handle method is different. But the gist of it is, particularly in the social sciences, a lot of experiments that people were doing that had really big, interesting results. Other researchers were returning to them and attempting to reproduce those results, and they weren't seeing the same thing, right? So, these would be things like research saying if you stand a particular way, people will believe you significantly more than if you stand in a different way, right? It's, a big shocking result. It's like this very simple thing you can do and it'll persuade people more. With further research, the effect hasn't been nearly as pronounced or potentially not there at all. I'm just using that as an example, but we're seeing this writ large in the social sciences and in the natural sciences too, where it's like, you'd think physics still exists. So why, when I'm doing this experiment, should it come out any different? But in a lot of cases it is. And we don't exactly know what's going on right now. It's why it's called the reproducibility crisis. There are some hypotheses that it could be just regression to the mean, right? That earlier studies unknowingly saw an effect that if you do more and more and more studies, it balances out. It's not nearly as strong. It's just we happened to catch it on the edge of the curve. If you do more of them, it's actually a more moderate effect. So it could just be expected regression to the mean. It could be that. It could be now we have more precision. So things that we thought were happening, if you look at them in more precise ways, maybe they weren't, or maybe there's another factor there we hadn't considered, right? So it could just be increased precision. It's probably not fraudulence. I mean, there is some fraudulence, but it's just too broad and in too many areas to be, a couple of people cheating. So we don't exactly know what's happening, but all of this is to say, there's been in the past few years, a big wave of replication studies where people have just taken existing literature and said, oh, I'm going to try and do the same thing. I'm going to take your methods section and just do it and see if I come up with the same result. And in a lot of cases, they're not. So that's something else you can do, is just straight up replication studies, right? The point here is we're not just presenting known information, right? That's not really what research is. It's reporting. Research is adding new knowledge. So adding to that collection of understood knowledge by applying it in new ways, by challenging or modifying it, even by straight up replicating what exists to see, does it hold, which is still new knowledge, right? Well, we tried this and we got the exact same result. That really provides evidence that this, is strong, right? It's impossible to prove anything, probably for certainty, we can only disprove. But this is more evidence that yes, we did the same thing, we got the same results, right? Its reproducibility is even stronger today than it was yesterday. So all of that is to say, we want to think about what we're doing with our question and our method, right? If you're finding that your research question is already answered, you probably want to think, well, then what am I doing here, right? I probably need to just modify my research question and then maybe even modify my method to suit it, so that I am adding knowledge. And I know this seems like a huge task. How do I add knowledge, but everyone is. I mean, we all are. You just need a couple of tweaks to be doing something novel, adding new knowledge to what exists. Are there any questions about that? Okay, I'm seeing head shakes. All right, so we don't need to harp on that too much. It's just something I noticed and wanted to point out. Relatedly, let's take a look at this other thing, the reflection here. So the gist of this is it's a reflective document, as its name suggests, or it's a form asking you questions about your work. This is the kind of thing that, unlike our other materials where you really should probably be doing draft, revision, feedback, that kind of cycle, here you can probably do this all at once. I'd encourage you to look over your responses, but it's asking you questions about you and your process. So as long as you take it seriously, as it points out, respond to it prompt or thoroughly, which means perhaps a paragraph per prompt, and use appropriate mechanics. So, this is for it's for me, it's for a semi-formal audience. Then you'll probably be fine. This whole document is only 5 points, which in the grand scheme of our course is not a whole lot, right? I mean, even the workshops collectively are 13 points, research papers 50. So this is one of the lower ones. In part, that's because it's just not as rigorous. It's something you can probably do in one sitting. It's something that really just asks you questions about your own work. So take it seriously, but it's just not it's not one of our more labor-intensive things. So it asks questions like the publication venue. Previously, of course, we identified some options that we might be targeting, right? Now's the time just to have the one set. Excuse me. This will be due after our research paper, so you'll know, okay, I'm writing it for this one. So it says, please identify the venue, the journal or conference you selected for your work and state its associated citation system. Now for journals, they'll have citation systems. The way you can find that out is either just go to the journal and look at a recent publication and you'll see how they're all being treated, or you can click on the for authors or about this journal, anything, any information that it has for potential authors, and they'll tell you their citation system. So journals will have a citation system, and you want to identify that. Sometimes there'll be things like we use APA, except we have this little tweak. You can point that out here. Now, conferences don't necessarily say, hey, we use this citation system, because a conference, unless they're going to be published proceedings, that's people delivering papers, right? They're presenting them, they're talking. So they may not identify a specific citation system. If you're targeting a conference, you can really just make an educated guess, right? It doesn't stipulate a citation system, but I'm just using APA because that's prevalent in my field. Or I'm using MLA, or I'm using, AMA, American Medical Association, whatever, because it's prevalent in my field. Sorry, my dog's outside and losing his mind. Let's see. Discuss why this venue would be an appropriate fit, considering, for example, your subject matter, your methods, and similar works that already appear in this venue. So you want to have an answer for why this would be an appropriate fit, right? So I targeted this journal or this conference, and it's appropriate fit because it covers similar subject matter, right? This journal's about the thing I'm studying. Similar methods, right? Other papers here are using surveys, and so am I. Here are some examples, right? This paper by Smith and Jones in this journal is using a similar survey. So it seems like my methods are appropriate for this journal. Similar works that already appear. So other things already in the publication that are similar to what you're doing, or particularly things like I cited this person's work in my paper. So probably this journal where that person's published, it makes sense for me to be there too, right? But that's the gist of it. Identify the particular venue and its citation system. And then just explain briefly why. Why is that one an appropriate choice? And we've already kind of talked about this previously in class. Moving on, we've got a question of method. Oh, and you might notice it's got 5 points here, and then every other question is 0. The reason why is this is 5 points total, and there aren't 5 questions, so they can't be 1 point apiece. So all the points are just dumped onto one question. Don't be thrown by that. So method here, please discuss the particular perspective on your topic that your method afforded, considering, for example, what it allowed you to see and what aspects of the subject it did not address. What that means is, I'm looking into, let's say, the erosion of our beach here, and I'm doing a survey. So I can find out about people's thoughts and feelings about this issue, or what they're going to do if their business is affected by that. However, excuse me, I couldn't find out the rate in which it's occurring using a survey. I couldn't find out what plans the political institution has in place because I was surveying business owners or whatever. So what could you see, but also what couldn't you see? That is not a flaw. It's just a truism, right? Every way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. Every time you pick a method, that means you're not doing every other possible method. It's not a flaw. It just means, by the way I answered this question, here's the kind of answers I could get. I could get thoughts and feelings. I couldn't establish correlation because I wasn't doing an experiment, right? So point out specifically what you could, and then some aspects that you couldn't see. Truth be told, there's a limited number of things that you could see probably, and theoretically an infinite number of things you couldn't see. I don't expect you to point them all out. And then some other reflective questions like time use. Please discuss your workflow and how you managed your time. What I don't want here is just a list of the calendar dates. I know that. I just want personally, how did you spend your time doing this? And this is not used against you. So, if there are times where it's like, I was busy with other stuff and I just couldn't finish my method design in the time frame I wanted to, so I had to crunch and just do it, the night before. This is the time to mention that, right? It helps you see what your workflow is, and that helps you going forward make changes. One thing about these reflective documents is they're certainly useful for me, but ideally they're also useful for the person. You end up having to write these a lot in professional situations. Like, anytime you finish a project, you have to do this kind of reporting because it helps identify inefficiencies. Revision, please discuss one significant way that you revised your work during our production process, considering, for example, what precipitated this shift and how you responded. I mean, a big one's probably the shutdown, right? Is anyone in the situation where like your method changed because of the shutdown? Anybody? Karen? Hold on, let me unmute you here real quick. What happened with you?
Well, mine was basically interview based, going to the recycling center there at the school, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So now I have to go, like, I probably have to find, and I haven't done it yet, and I haven't even submitted my draft because I'm like at a, it's like, what do you do? Everything just fell,
What are you going to do?
I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to research a little bit more and turn it into like a research paper type versus the interview. I don't know. I mean, I wanted to discuss that with you anyway,
Yeah, it'll be something for us to discuss because, yeah, and this happens now almost never for this reason, but, this is a great example. I was going to do interviews, but now I physically can't contact these people. Have you considered something like an electronic interview?
No, I mean, I had considered it, yeah, but I don't know. I mean, if she'd be willing to do that or not. I really have to get a hold of her still,
Yeah. I mean, that would be a consideration is, well, is this something I could do over the phone or something I could do, by email or something like that. But if it's the case where it's like, I can't get a hold, or as you point out, this person just never responds to me and my whole work was dependent upon this, then you might have to shift method. Okay, I can't do interviews. What can I do? Could I revise my question and do a survey? Could I switch to doing something like a meta-analysis where I can just get data and not have to worry about people? People are always such a weird data point. They don't cooperate the way documents do.
As I learned,
Yeah, that's the crux of social science work is you're working with people and they're tough. But I mean, this is common that, you have to make these kinds of revisions. So that's the thing we're looking at here is what's one way you had to revise. Now it could be something like our peer feedback. Someone pointed out I was doing this particular thing and that really helped me. I mean, this can be whatever you want, but you do want to think in terms of how did you revise, which again is not a flaw. It's part of the process. And then the big three of personal reflection, they're generally versions of this almost always in these kinds of documents. We've got what went right. So please discuss your greatest success, right? And that's the whole project, not just the paper. But what for you do you think went really well or you're most proud of or whatever? The flip side, what went wrong? Discuss what was your greatest challenge during this project. I bet the shutdown will come up there quite a bit for people, although it did give us extra time. And then lessons learned. Please discuss something that you learned from this project that you can apply in the future. And that can be as focused or as broad as you like. So people in the past have put things like, well, I'm actually working on a similar project for my senior research, and this helped me fill in a couple of blanks. And so it really helped me there. Or something like, in looking at my workflow, I now know I've got to schedule this earlier because it was under a real crunch and it just didn't work out right, or something like that. So it can be broader and more abstract. It can be focused and more specific. Doesn't really matter. Just something you can take away from this experience. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, fantastic. This is due, we've actually got quite a while to do this, even though, as I mentioned, I don't imagine it'll take you very long to do it. I mean, it'll, maybe take you an evening, not even. But we've got until, I think it's the 3rd of April. Yeah, end of day, April 3rd. So this will be due after the research paper. It's basically that research paper is due on a Monday. This is due end of day on that Friday. So you should have plenty of time once you wrap up with your research paper to complete the reflection. Okay. Yeah, good. So what I wanted to do with the rest of our time here is just briefly chat about the reading from last time, where we looked at chapters 16, 17, 18. We probably won't get through them all this time. Chapter 16 was about condensing. And we are, in just a minute here, we'll go through a couple of the exercises here in the chapter. But just really quick, I wanted to point out a few of the things in the book itself that I think are useful. So, the thing about condensing is, usually we're so trained, because of our previous education, we're so trained to be verbose, right? That we're trying to hit page counts, we're trying to hit word counts. So condensing is often the last thing on our minds. But as the chapter points out, sort of the more experience you get, and as you start working in, institutional genres like, academic research, or, public genres, public science genres, it actually kind of switches, where you're no longer trying to hit word counts, you're trying to get under maximums, right? The chapter points out, this couldn't be more than 15 pages, or, as is the case with virtually every journal that exists, you can't go above this word count, right? 6,000 to 9,000 words, no more, no less. So condensing becomes really important. And as it points out on page 160 under 16.1, it says brevity comes from selection, not compression. A lesson that requires lifting blocks from the work. I think that's super important, because you can only sort of nibble around the edges when you're dealing with compression. You can take the same text and reduce it. You definitely can by, a certain percentage. I don't have a hard figure, maybe 20%. I don't know if that. In terms of, okay, well, I'll take this sentence and I can boil this down to fewer words. You can do that, but it's really just kind of nibbling around the edges. When you need to make big condensing decisions, then you have to deal with selection, right? What's the story I'm actually telling? And so this section stays, this section goes, these paragraphs go. This whole thing I'm talking about here is out, right? I have to do that all the time. I mean, I'm doing it right now. As I mentioned before, I'm doing this text mining stuff. I had all this stuff ready to go. It's got to go. It's interesting but tangential, and it would bump things way too high, right? So selection is what's key to condensing. Word and sentence level condensing, which most of this chapter is about, that's important, and it can really make the difference if you're pretty close. But if you're nowhere close at all, you've got to select, what is the story I'm actually telling? And that means cutting out all this good stuff you've written, right? But it's just choices you have to make. The way I think of it is, you're not going to throw it away. It's just, you're going to use that in a different paper, because often you're going to be writing in the same topic at least a few times. So the rest of this chapter, I think, is kind of useful, pointing out what you can do on sort of the word and sentence and paragraph level. On 161, it has this list of things, right? Redundancies, obvious. Now, right away, he's committed a faux pas because those should all be the same part of speech, and that's called parallelism, right? Let's turn them all into nouns here. Redundancies, obvious information, modifiers, metadiscourse, verbose language, right? Now they're all the same part of speech. So these have their definitions, right? What redundant is, what obvious is. And they provide examples in this chapter. We're not going to pour over these, but I do encourage you to look at those because he walks through, here's something that's obvious, here's how it could be fixed. Modifiers, and as it points out, often you can get rid of a lot of adverbs and adjectives, but there will be ones that you have to retain. The example it uses on 160, I think, is it 2? No, I'm sorry, it's 166. The first phase of the reaction sequence, right? First is a modifier. You can't pull that out though, because you need to know it's a restrictive modifier. Pulling it out changes the meaning of the sentence. There are also non-restrictive ones, which you can pull them out and it doesn't actually change the semantics. Those are ones you can generally get rid of. He also points out things like metadiscourse, talking about what you're doing, which you don't have to do. A lot of times we use metadiscourse because, particularly at this point, if you're not super comfortable just saying a thing is the case, right? The data shows this. Sometimes people couch that in metadiscourse. When we run this, it shows this. And see, a lot of that is just sort of like I don't feel comfortable making a strong assertion, but in the sake of clarity, it's useful to trim that away, right? Here's what it shows, right? And then verbosity, you're just using too much words. I mean, too many words. Really, all of this falls under verbosity. And the thing about condensing is it's not just getting rid of words for, an arbitrary word count or something like that. It's clarity. It actually makes things more clear when you trim away the fat. We have research on this, things like readability. People tend to get more out of this stuff if the fat is trimmed away. That said, as the book points out, there are reasons to leave in things. Here on 172 and 173, not to kill every possible word, there is still the need to put in connective tissue. It gives us a couple of examples here at the top of 173, sort of two statements. And words that are in there to do things like connect parts together, those are going to be important, right? In fact, it makes your other condensing tasks that much more important because you have to retain that connective tissue for things to make sense. So like a lot of these things, it feels like, how do you possibly write like this? Most people don't. I mean, when you draft, you just draft. Mostly you're dealing with these kind of fine-grained things in the revision and then editing cycles, right? So we have enough time to do this. What I want us to do really quickly is just individually here at the bottom of 173, it's got A, B, and C under 16.2. It gives us just a couple of examples, or excuse me, 3 examples here to practice condensing. So I want us just individually to take just a couple minutes here, just pick one of them, either A, B, or C. Ideally, somebody will pick each one, but it won't matter. Pick one of those and condense it down. Take a few minutes with that, and then we'll talk about the choices we made in order to do that. Okay, so take just a minute or two with that, please. take just another moment with that, if you could, please. Okay, so let's chat about these a little bit. Did anyone do the first one, A? Nobody did that one? Okay. We can walk through this. So let's look at it. It says polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated biphenyls are challenging to remediate. It costs a lot of money and it threatens the health of workers who are exposed to the compounds. Let's look at that first part. Is there any way you might shorten that first part before the colon? Anyone have an idea? You're all unmuted, by the way. Any thoughts? Nobody? Emily, what do you think?
I looked at it and I don't know. I feel like it's mostly important information, like polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polycoordinated biphenyls are two very distinct things that have to be separated. And
Okay.
challenging to remediate isn't really lengthy or like overly verbose, I guess.
Well, that's a good point. And so the thing following the colon, it costs a lot of money and it threatens the health of workers. Is that why it's challenging? I mean, it looks like, I mean, that's the job of a colon, right? A colon introduces, here's why. So I think what it's saying there is it's challenging because of these things. So that might give us some guidance about potential ways to revise this, right? We can maybe shift remediate to the beginning. So remediating polyaromatic hydrocarbons and polychlorinated biphenyls. And instead of saying is challenging, which we could just interpret that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe are expensive, it costs a lot of money, or are expensive, or is expensive, right? Remediating, yeah, is expensive. And we can probably condense threatens the health of workers who are exposed to compounds. I mean, maybe we can maybe say something like is dangerous to workers exposed to the compounds, right? So potentially we could boil things down that way. You do bring up a good point here, though, which is some of this is going to be dependent upon subject matter expertise, right? When you look at this, I don't know anything about these. So when I look at this, I'm like, well, the only thing I have to go on is I know what a colon does, and I know I can shift remediating to the beginning here. But in terms of is saying it's dangerous to workers who are exposed, is that the same as saying it threatens the health of workers? I don't know, right? Someone else would have to, someone who's a subject matter expert might have to make that call. What about the second one? Did anyone do B? Nobody did. Did everyone do C, or no one just wants to volunteer?
I did see.
Well, let's take a look at B really quickly. When expression of CHLA, which I think is chlorophyll, but I don't know, and CHLB were compared, similar patterns of transcript abundance were observed in plants at different developmental stages. So is there anything there that it looks like right at the beginning we could cut out, right? This bit that says when expression of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B were compared. That's a perfect example of meta discourse. The thing the chapter talks about it's talking about what they're doing, right? When we compare these things, here's what happens. You don't really need to include that. Just say what happens, right? CLA and CLB, transcript abundance showed similar patterns in plants at different developmental stages. We don't have to say that they were compared. When we point out that they're showing different patterns, that means we compared them. In fact, technically, we contrasted them. We didn't compare them. Comparing is finding similarities. Contrasting is finding differences. So we can cut that meta discourse out completely and just say they show different things in this situation, right? It's a great example of getting rid of meta discourse. What about this last one? Everyone did C, I'm guessing. Who did C?
I did.
Okay, well, what do you think? This is the longest one.
Yeah, well, when you first read it, you're like, it's every sentence is plant, plant, plant. So you could eliminate that altogether.
And
just,
inherent resistance. Look at the start of each sentence. Inherent resistance, inherent
Right.
resistance. And then
Right.
it comes up later, inherent resistance.
in plants. Yeah, you don't have to have all of that. You could just touch on the finer points. Plants response to living in environments that are consistently harsh, don't require to induce any specific psychological mechanisms to stress. They are inherent, I mean, that might be a run-on sentence though. They are inherently resistant, to characterize traits such as high root by extensive, and the rest of that sentence.
Yeah. Sorry,
To
I was
get
just
rid-
answering a question folks had about the word count in our paper. Just to clarify. Yeah, I mean, I think ours is what? The minimum is 2,000. Is that what ours is? I think that's the case. I'll have to check.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, talking about condensing, we're not trying to get under that. In fact, really what we're shooting for is a reasonable one. But yeah, looking at this, when you notice patterns, as you point out, things being repeated, words being repeated, plants, 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 or resistance, that's probably stuff we can groom out, right? So we could boil it down to something like inherent resistance is an evolved response to living in, and we can change that, constantly harsh environments, right?
Right.
Then we can maybe shift and put the plants themselves as the subject here. Resistant plants don't induce a physiological response to stress. Rather, they have traits such as high root biomass, extensive chemical defenses, and low growth rates. Then we can take that paragraph and distill this really to a couple of sentences by taking the things that come up again and again, just make them a subject and say, okay, well, here's what's going on with that subject. There are lots of other ways potentially to revise this. But that's a good example where if you're seeing patterns of things being repeated, sentence, 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 I bet you can distill that down. You might have to rewrite, a couple of sentences into one, but that's great in terms of condensing. Okay, yeah, we're almost out of time. And then let's see, just to make sure. So yeah, was that your question, Juan or Emily, about the word count?
I attempted to answer the question.
What was it? Just what's the word count on the assignment?
Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just check, just so I'm not giving people bad information here. Yeah, it says it should be approximately 2,000 words. That's our guidance. And again, I mean, I'm not super stringent. I'm not going to count them, but I know about how much depth 2,000 words is. I mean, that's about 6 or 7 pages. But really what I want to see is that level of depth. Okay, really quickly, let me share my screen with you and then we'll wrap up here. For Wednesday, remember we're picking back up with our popular science response cycle. So now we're back to infographics. Man, everything is just dominated with coronavirus news. In fact, one of ours might find something other than coronavirus news. But for this one, it's asking locate an infographic, a visual document that presents digested data that communicates science information for a broad readership. Then respond to the following prompts. They're exactly the same. So it's what we've seen before. Cite it, summarize it, discuss how it's working rhetorically, how it communicates as a document, and then how it's treating information, right? So is it faithful to its sources? Is it relying upon other works? Right? The same 4 questions. Okay, that's the gist of how things are gonna go. As I mentioned, I'll be holding these classes for the rest of the semester. I encourage you to participate, but you are not strictly required to. So, if you're in a situation, and I know people's schedules are going to be nuts the next few weeks, where you can't make a session, that's perfectly fine. You can watch the recording, and all the assignments you can do asynchronously. Did anybody have any questions or anything right now? Okay. All right, folks, that's it. I'm going to send the whole class an email just with a reminder once the video recording processes. All right, I will see you hopefully on Wednesday. See you, folks. Stay
Is
healthy.
there any way I can talk to you? Like,
Well, I got another meeting at 2. I guess we can talk for 10 minutes. Let me just stop the recording here.
okay.
See ya. Okay, not you, Karen.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Okay.
Give me just 1 minute. I've got to shut off the live stream.